I'm very pleased to be able to interview Bruce Charlton. Bruce Charlton is a prodigious blogger. He has innumerable blogs, but I want to concentrate on two Inkling related blogs, the Notion Club Papers and his Owen Barfield blog. So first, who do you regard as the key Inklings?
For me, they're the usual four: J.R.R.Tolkien, C.S.Lewis, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams. But I'm also very keen on Warnie Lewis, brother of C.S. Lewis, and I've read a fair bit of Neville Coghill as well. He was best known as a Chaucer scholar.
Uh-huh.
So for me, they're the main ones.
Do you think of the Inklings as a group of writers? And if so, how?
I've got an independent interest in Tolkien and Lewis, even if they weren't a group.
Mm.
But yes, I definitely do think of them as a group of writers. And I think that they're a group of writers for us nowadays in a way that they possibly weren't at the time. So the Inklings themselves have at various times denied that they were a group, Lewis and
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien in particular, and some of the other Inklings, like Havard, the doctor, he sort of denied that they were a special group, but they were just a social gathering. However, I think that we now can see that they are a group in a way that they couldn't see at the time. And in particular, this applies to Owen Barfield, because Owen Barfield only seldom actually met with the other Inklings. And therefore, at a personal level, he was mainly Jack Lewis's friend. And but we can now see, I think, that there's a very close spiritual relation between Barfield and Tolkien, for example,
Mm-hmm.
although in real life they didn't know each other very well and didn't particularly hit it off. I don't mean that they were hostile. It's just that, in particular, Barfield didn't really respond to Tolkien's work in general.
Mm.
But I think in a sort of spiritual or ideal sense, you can see that there's a very important relation between Tolkien and Barfield.
What inspired you to name your Inklings blog the Notion Club Papers after this little known work of Tolkien's?
Well, it started out as a Notion Club Papers blog. This was a novel that Tolkien started in 1945 and six, but never finished. And the first time I read it, I sort of was moderately interested by it, but it stuck in my mind, and I had to keep going back to it again and again and rereading it. And every time I reread it, I got more from it, and I just became a real enthusiast for this neglected work. And I realized that it isn't the sort of work that bowls people over. So therefore, I wanted to try and encourage more people to read it and appreciate it, because it really has some remarkable things in it, such as what seem like great personal revelations from Tolkien in a fictional form, which you don't get anywhere else. And discussions about things like dreams that are real dreams that are telling you, precognitive dreams and things like this, spiritual things, ghosts, for example. They talk about ghosts, and that they all seem to believe in ghosts, and this aspect of the Inklings is pretty much left out of the normal accounts. So the Notion Club Papers is a window into a more sort of esoteric side of the Inklings. So I started the blog to expound the Notion Club Papers, but of course, because of my interest in all the other aspects, it has changed into being a general Inklings blog. Now, the thing, of course, is that the Notion Club of the title is a fictional version of the Inklings. That's how it began, and it still retains some links. So it's like an alternative Inklings blog, which allows me to speculate much more than other Tolkien and Lewis scholars speculate. I'm very speculative about what they're really thinking, how their creativity
Mm.
works, and such like that.
Mm. Mm. How do you think the Inklings complemented each other? Thinking particularly in terms of Barfield, Lewis, and Tolkien.
they are the three that really complement each other. Um, and Williams is slightly off on a side. I've got various other theories about Williams, but you can ask me about them afterwards if you want. I'll say those three. Um, the relation between Barfield and Lewis is quite well described, particularly by Barfield, who wrote a book about it. So they have a complementary relationship in that Barfield was a theoretician of imagination, while C.S. Lewis was a practitioner of imagination through his Narnia books and the science fiction trilogy. I think that Barfield was a better thinker than Lewis, a more original and bold thinker than Lewis, and Lewis would not go along with Barfield's theories, although they were very well. Barfield's theories are very well worked out. Lewis didn't refute them and didn't fully engage with them, but they're there. Um, and on the other side, Barfield himself was not a first-rate imaginative writer. His imaginative writings are always interesting, but never fully successful, in my view. Um, so he did write fictional stuff, but I've never found it genuinely convincing. So they are complementary in that if you put the two together, you get a greater person than the sum than either of them separately. Now, if you put Tolkien in as well, Tolkien brought an extra level to the imaginative world because Tolkien was, while C.S. Lewis was a really good imaginative writer, it was more of a calculated and intellectual thing for Lewis, whereas Tolkien, it had this combination of a tremendous spontaneous kind of well, I don't know, he's like a shaman, Tolkien, in that he material welled up in him, imaginative material, and then he developed it with a scholarly rigor. So and Tolkien, has this deep spirituality in his writings, which is very deep. It isn't very superficial, but in the way that he looks at things like destiny, how destiny works in the Lord of the Rings, how dreams of Frodo link with the rest of reality. There's just a tremendously satisfying quality about Tolkien's writing. I mean, Lord of the Rings for me is the book of books. I've been reading it for 45 years or something, and it's inexhaustible. I'm reading it to my wife now as a bedtime book, which is the third time we've read it out loud. Of course, I've read it to myself many times. It's inexhaustible for me. So putting the three together, you get a really tremendous, depth and range. But Barfield is really important to this because, to me, Barfield's ideas about imagination were very exactly enacted and taken to the fullest expression by Tolkien, although Barfield himself was not able to appreciate that. He didn't even finish The Lord of the Rings. It just didn't resonate with him.
It does seem that there are synergies between all three of those writers, but in different ways they all failed to realize it.
No, absolutely, yes, or denied it.
Yes.
I mean, they seem to be very concerned to deny what 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 critics called influence, and I think that perhaps influence is not the right way to look at it. I'm quite happy to look at it at a spiritual level, that there was something going on behind the scenes that was more important than the actual material interactions that they had. That that whatever they thought was going on in their relationships between each other, in fact, more was going on, and we can easily see this now that they just objectively have a cultural power now that they did not have 70 years ago.
Did Tolkien get it all caught up in the Great War between Barfield and Lewis?
No, it happened before he met Tolkien, really. That if he met Tolkien, Lewis met Tolkien through their work together in the English faculty at Oxford, and the relationship grew somewhat gradually. I think it was about 1927-ish.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and first of all, there was a bit of coldness between them, and then they gradually got to know each other through this coal biters club. Learning, Tolkien was teaching other faculty members Old Icelandic, um, and Lewis joined this group with his interest in northernness. And I think that was what warmed them. And then Tolkien gave Lewis a poem he was working on, the Lay of Leithen, that was about Beren and Luthien. And I think that was the one he gave him. And Lewis just loved it unreservedly and wrote reams of criticism of it. And this was what cemented them, because they realized that they were this deeply, at a deep level, the same kind of person with the same interests. And that
Mm-hmm.
started it off. So that was after the Great War, which was in mostly the sort of middle 20s. After after Barfield had left Oxford, they started to write letters to each other and supplement it with conversations, and that was the Great War. When it was the sort of preliminary to C.S. Lewis becoming a theist, believing in God, and then a Christian. Was this
Mm-hmm.
was Barfield arguing from his anthroposophy point of view for the the reality of deity, and that imagination was not simply something that happened in your head, but something that related to the real world.
Mm. My understanding is that Barfield was quite instrumental in getting Lewis to be a theist, and that Tolkien was instrumental in him becoming a Christian. Is that?
Yes, I uh, I think that's probably true. In that, I mean, and certainly Barfield was a theist for a while before he was a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
The chronology has been worked out by Alistair McGrath in his recent biography of Lewis, and it's sort of been slightly revised. I'm convinced that McGrath is correct about that. So the actual dates are somewhat different from those Lewis gave in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, but that sequence is there. And that was very interesting to me, because I was an atheist for most of my life, and I had a sort of period of theism before I became a Christian as well. Um, and I think so. Lewis's particular personal experience, is something that I feel very sympathetic about. And in fact, a lot of my writing is about what is special about Jesus, because it wasn't something that was immediately obvious to me either, and that I had to sort of work through and continue to do so.
The Inklings obviously had a deep engagement with the past, but do you also see a futuristic element in their work?
Yes, I do, definitely. I've been writing for the last few years on my blog about what I think is the future, and I've now decided to call it Romantic Christianity, which is an adaptation of the best book about the Inklings, a very little known book by R.J. Riley called Romantic Religion. So it's just making it more specifically Christian rather than just religion. So Romantic Christianity is what I take from these three, Tolkien, Lewis, and Barfield, the synergistic relationship, and particularly using Barfield's theoretical basis, which is that the Romantic Revolution that happened, with people like Coleridge and Wordsworth and Blake back around about before 1800, but around about there, was something that represents a change in the human consciousness that affects people whether they like it or not. It's just a change, and that this went off the rails for a couple of 100 years, in which Romanticism became non-Christian and Christianity rejected Romanticism. And the thesis is that what the Inklings did was they took this up again. They took up Romantic Christianity from the early days implicitly, although for Barfield it was explicit, but for Tolkien and Lewis it was implicit. And they brought them back together again, and that this is the proper way that humans are destined uh, to develop or evolve in an old sense of evolution. So absolutely. I think that the Inklings represent, as a group, taken together, what ought to be the future for certainly Western man.
Hmm.
And they couldn't be anything more relevant or important than this. This is the key issue of our time, and the key issue for every human being, at least every Western human being, uh, is exactly what the Inklings are doing. So yes, there's nothing more important than the Inklings for the future.
With that in mind, what do you make of the enormous popularity of The Lord of the Rings?
Well, I think it's the enormous popularity of the Lord of the Rings is at a lower level. At least looking at the fan websites
Mm-hmm.
and productions, it's about sort of the soap opera kind of aspects of it. But there is underlying this mass popularity, a very large, genuine, deep popularity among people who reread the
Mm-hmm.
texts. I think if people read The Lord of the Rings once, then that's nice, but that's not the point. It's the people that engage with it at a deeper level, that read the appendices, that use it as there are a lot of people use the Lord of the Rings almost like a scripture, in the sense that people use Old Testament stories to be an
Mm-hmm.
encapsulation of eternal human situations, and people do that. I do it all the time with the Lord of the Rings. That it encompasses so many basic human situations. So I think at that level, people are responding to a need. But what they're not doing is taking it that step further that I would like them to take it, or that I am trying to take. Because, of course, most of my life I was an atheist reading The Lord of the Rings and being
Mm-hmm.
enraptured by it and being entranced by it. But putting it in a box in my mind, this is imagination. This is ultimately, it may educate me in real life. It may engage me at a deep level, entertain me, and all these other things. But I didn't see it as I do now, which is as a fundamental, part of a fundamental um, way of relating to the world, and that the Lord of the Rings is real in a sense that it is objectively real. It's not simply happening inside people's heads. That
Mm-hmm.
it's referring to a world of thought that is universal and um, just as real as anything else is. So I have a much more um, truth orientated appreciation of the Lord of the Rings than I did in the past, which was more emotionally orientated.
Mm-hmm. The Owen Barfield blog at some point detached itself from the Notion Club Papers blog. Why did that happen? Did it signify a change in your approach to Barfield?
Well, yes, certainly. I mean, I found it much harder to appreciate Barfield and to get onto his wavelength than Tolkien or Lewis. So Tolkien was the first for me. Lewis came quite a bit later. Um, that I didn't particularly warm to the Narnian stories as a child. I liked them in a mild kind of way, and it's really only in the last few years that I've come to love the Narnian stories and really regard them as first rate. And it's a question of being on the right wavelength. The Barfield, I had Barfield books. I've sort of looked back to when I bought books, probably more than 10 years. I've been trying to read Barfield, and it just wasn't sinking in. I don't really think that the way that Barfield is usually presented gets you to a deep level. I think that people he's usually presented in a rather superficial way, as being somebody that noticed the meanings of words changing and so on. That's how he usually presented himself, but he's actually a much more substantial writer than that. So it was the book called The Fellowship, which is
Ah.
a biography of the Inklings, that opened up Barfield for me, by the Zaleski couple, a husband and wife team, which I think is the best book about the Inklings as a phenomenon. It superseded the Humphrey Carpenter book about the Inklings and Diana Pavlak Glyer's book about the Inklings as a writing group. I think that the Fellowship is now the best one. And in particular, what I got from that was Barfield. I got an understanding of what Barfield was going on. It just suddenly the scales fell from my eyes and I realized. And I think that the key thing was that the Zaleskis had read thoroughly and understood Riley's book, the Romantic Religion book, which is from the 1960s, a great book. And they had understood, because Riley understood about Barfield, he wrote over 100 pages of exposition of Barfield's ideas and thoroughly, deeply understood them. That the Zaleskis were able to open up Barfield in a way that the previous writers on the Inklings had never done for me. And then suddenly I just went back and reread the Barfields I had, and then I bought all of the other ones, and I realized that he was on my wavelength in a way that none of the other Inklings really are. I think if I had met Barfield, I would have been talking and talking for hours and hours, whereas I would perhaps have been, I couldn't admire anybody more than I admire Tolkien, but I don't know that we would have hit it off as human beings in the way that I think I would have hit it off with Barfield. I really felt an affinity for him. So this is really only the past 5 years that we're talking about, in which I've absolutely immersed myself in Barfield. And as you say, I started to write more and more about him on the Notion Club Papers blog until I thought, I want to sort of bring it together and help a few other people into Barfield to appreciate this depth of Barfield that people don't seem to notice. And that got me an award for that blog from the Owen Barfield one. His grandson, Owen Barfield, gave me this award for excellence, which I was really pleased with. It was very nice to be recognized, because simply writing a blog, you sort of wonder whether it's having any impact, but he appreciated it anyway, and that was very encouraging. So I've carried on.
It's the only Owen Barfield blog that I'm aware of, and you write about him in such an engaged way.
Well, to me, it's life and death. It's Barfield's ideas are not just something I'm vaguely interested in. I regard him as one of a very small number of people who I think are the deepest spiritual guides I've ever located, and that I'm reading as a matter of what I think is the most important thing in the world. And via him, I've gone to Steiner, his master, which is a very difficult business, but I've spent hundreds of hours reading Steiner and listening to him read out. I was doing so this morning, and there's this chap William Arkell, who is a very little known person who happened to live in the same village I was brought up in, and who I belatedly discovered. And I would actually put William Arkell on a level with Barfield as a major spiritual thinker of our time. Now, obviously, there's a very small number of people that would agree with me, but I agree. I am convinced that Arkell brings something extra. So he's a sort of honorary Inkling for me as well.
You've already brought this up before, but the term romantic Christianity, I just wanted to know if you could explain that anymore, and how you thought the Inklings exemplified that.
Well, people have this term romantic is a very, it's a very important, but it's imprecise. But I think we all kind of know what it means. It's to do with imagination and the importance of imagination. It's to do with individuality. And ultimately, it's this very difficult thing, which nowadays I feel that everybody has to engage with things at a personal level and make an intuitive personal validation before it can be accepted. We simply won't take external authority as the bottom line in the way that people clearly did in the past. And I think that this is the case even for people that deny it. I think that you can see that implicitly they are actually making a personal decision about everything. And so ultimately the romantic is to do with this this internalization of judgment, evaluation, and commitment that we have to make. So Christians have tended to define themselves in terms of external revelation, things coming from outside. everybody, including Christians, is nowadays, if they're compelled to totally affirm things from within themselves, from within that which is divine in each person. So that's why I eventually settled upon romantic as the sort of adjective before Christian,
Mm-hmm.
and as a result of seeing that the Inklings were all in their different ways. Um, the main Inklings were all concerned with this romantic quality, even though someone like Lewis would have sort of denied it. I think you can actually see that in his work,
Mm.
he is giving this exactly this priority of a person um, having to affirm intuitively whatever comes from outside.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I've really enjoyed doing this interview. There are links to Bruce's blogs in the description of this video below. I highly recommend them. They're great blogs. I've got a lot of value from them. Thank you.